Good morning. I'd like to also acknowledge the Gamaragal people and pay my respects to elders past and present. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I am Solange, I'm the manager of the Policy Advocacy team, and I'm delighted to be joined by Sue Weatherley, John Engeler and Graham West. I had the fortune to talk with our panel earlier in the week, and the passion, expertise around housing and where we should be going for housing justice in this state could probably take up a whole day. They have incredible knowledge about this subject matter, so I'm very excited that they were here with us this morning. A little bit more about the three of them. So Sue is the principal of Weatherley Associates. She is the New South Wales Divisional President of the Planning Institute of Australia. She's a passionate and successful urban planner and senior local government executive with over 30 years' experience. Sue has been recognised as the recipient of the Minister's Award for Women in Local Government in November 2018. And she has been recognised twice for her contribution to local government. In November 2018, the Planning Institute of Australia named Sue as the Planner of the Year in its annual Excellence Awards, and she is a Fellow of the Planning Institute of Australia. Welcome, Sue. So John Engeler is the CEO of Shelter New South Wales and the Chair of National Shelter. John joined Shelter as the CEO in early 2020, having been involved in the formation and development and operation of social, affordable and specialist housing for most of his professional life. John has a master's degree in urban and regional planning and has undertaken postgraduate legal studies, and I think he's fairly close to being an honorary Vincentian, having attended numerous social justice forums, and we're very pleased that he's joining us again this year. Thank you, John. And then finally, Graham West, the CEO of St Vincent de Paul Society Housing. So the Honourable Graham West is an experienced manager and leader in the not-for-profit sector and government. He has served as a minister in the New South Wales government and as a CEO, board chair, consultant and advocate. Graham has helped establish and lead services focused on helping those experiencing disadvantage, including homelessness services and mental health services. Graham believes that community is essential to creating long-term solutions. He holds a Master of International Studies and a Bachelor of Commerce. Welcome, Graham. As Brooke said, housing has been in a state of an affordability crisis for a long time. There was a big focus for our last Social Justice Forum 2 years ago. I think what has changed in those intermediary 2 years is that housing affordability is no longer just an issue of people of low incomes. We have seen it now become something that's affecting mainstream Australia and people on even middle incomes. So that has evoked a different response from our governments at state and federal level. And we're seeing much more discourse in the media around needing to increase housing supply. And you will have, the federal government has set a housing accord with quite high targets for the states to deliver on increased housing supply. Now in New South Wales, we haven't met our housing targets for a number of years, and the New South Wales government has signalled that. And so in response, they've introduced some reforms that are aimed at increasing housing density. And as Brooke noted, we saw this week the Premier announced that at least 80% of our growth targets for housing in New South Wales over the next 5 years will come from infill established sites rather than those greenfield new land spaces. So Sue, as an expert in the planning system, can you give us a layman's explanation about what these planning changes are that the government has introduced of late and what they mean for our communities?
I'm going to try my very best. And I apologise for my voice, or if I sniffle or cough. I've got a bit of a cold, and it's not the flu, it's not COVID, I have been tested. It's just annoying. So again, and I thank everyone for the invitation today. I think the Planning Institute is very pleased to be involved in this conversation, and I also pay my respects and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. So a very quick summary of the New South Wales planning system. There's an Act and there's regulations. and that basically says what can be done, gives authority to state government and councils primarily in terms of what they can and can't do. So from within the Act is a requirement for some strategic planning, metropolitan strategies, district plans, and at the local area, local strategic planning statements. And then there are the statutory documents, the things that set out in law what can and can't be built in different locations. It starts with state environmental planning policies called SEPs. So when I say SEP, I mean the state powers. They are supported by codes and policies as well. Below that, there's local environmental plans, often also called LEPs, and that's what the local council produces and has to be approved by the state government. The reason I need to explain that is because the way in which all the new controls have been introduced recently to actually try and increase density and therefore the future supply, primarily of private sector housing. There's been virtually nothing done in any of this which will actually increase affordable housing or social housing. So the private sector housing increase. So there's been, the other thing that's available to councils is to prepare affordable housing schemes or policies, and this is for affordable rental housing, where they can require or negotiate for new developments, usually when land is upzoned, to provide some affordable housing as a percentage of the total development. There's not very many of them across the state, very few in fact, very hard to do. I spent my career 5 years at Parramatta trying to get one across the line at Parramatta, and it got voted down every time. So the major changes, and these are being led by the state government, and because they're being led by the state government, they relate to SEPs. So the first one was a general bonus scheme. Now this has been the case for some period of time, that affordable rental housing has been provided as a reward for and provided as an incentive. So if you provide, you get additional development rights if you provide affordable housing. In the past, that's been limited to 10 years, so the affordable housing only has to be provided for 10 years, then it goes back into general housing. So it's sort of a short-term provision. The new provisions introduced by the current state government via a SEP was that for larger scale projects, they could get an additional 30% development rights, provided 15% of the total development was affordable rental housing managed by a community housing provider, but limited to 10 years only. So it only had to be affordable rental housing for 10 years. And there's another clause that some people quote, which is often referred to as clause 4.6. It's in every LEP, so that's the local plan, and it enables every development standard to be varied. Which means in this case you can get 40% bonus but only provide 10% of affordable rental housing. So while there's a standard, it could be varied. So that was the first thing, and that came into effect late last year. And then they started talking about transit or transport-oriented development. So you might have heard of those, TODs. So they've done it in two stages. The first stage has been what I call low-rise, 6-storey residential development, generally within 400 metres of some nominated railway stations, 35 overall, which would allow that development to take place close to the nominated railway stations. That came into effect at the beginning of May. I don't know that any DAs have been lodged yet. That would allow someone to develop 6 stories of residential development. The only requirement for affordable housing is that is a current levy of 2%. And only if the site is over 2,000 square metres. The state government is anticipating 178,000 dwellings over the next 15 years out of that provision, but 2% even of 178,000 isn't very many. They are in perpetuity or for the life of the building, and still some clarification required in terms of if it's in the ownership of a community housing provider or whether it just needs to be managed by a community housing provider. The stage 2 TODs are the accelerated precincts. So these are large-scale precincts around 8 nominated stations, including places like Kellyville, Macquarie Park, Hornsby, which is where I live. This is sometimes leveraging off work that the councils in those precincts have already done. For example, I know the Hornsby work's completed. It would take a long time to get a rezoning through the state government system, but the state introduces SEP, which will amend the local environmental plan. Now, the first, one point to make is the first lot of TODs that I talked about, the 6-storey ones close to those railway stations. No consultation because they're not required to consult with the community on those. So the large-scale precincts, they will consult on those, but it'll be minimal consultation because they need to implement them by the end of November, and that will amend the local environmental plan, and that's why they will consult. So that happens next. And then there's a thing called the low and mid-rise housing proposal, which will allow other forms of slightly higher density residential development in other locations. This includes allowing dual occupancies, no duplex, no 2 houses on the one block, either together or behind each other, in all R2, which is the lowest residential zone in New South Wales across the state, and then allow terraces, townhouses and 2-storey small apartment buildings, usually that's 4 apartments, near train stations and key town centres in the R2 zone, but generally only in Greater Sydney area. And then they'll allow mid-rise apartment blocks near the train stations and the key town centres in the R3 medium density zones across from Shoalhaven through Sydney to Newcastle. That's the best way to explain it. They are currently consulting on that, and they've received over 8,000 submissions just on the low rise. So there was some discussion this week, I think, about changes they might make to that, particularly I think in terms of lot sizes and a few things like that. And then the other thing that's been done is the housing targets, which increases the targets for some places significantly. I think it was Wallara's increases by 200%, but it's a very low base. They only had 600, the target for the next 5 years of 600 anyway, and they'll increase to sort of like 1,800 over the next years. So those, and that's supposed to reflect what the additional density or the number of dwellings that were produced by the current planning controls the councils have, plus these changes included in that. I'm almost on time, I think.
John, Shelter has been heavily involved in providing submissions in response to all of these raft of changes that have come out over the last 6 months. What's your assessment of whether all these changes will deliver more affordable housing, particularly for the people that the society and its members assist?
Really good to be with you. I acknowledge the traditional owners, of course. So just before we start, I have to say, when I get to speak on behalf of Shelter, I normally get to speak very objectively. It's my job, it's what I do. But when I come to address these groups, I hope that I get to speak from a different place. I've got a number of people in the room I'd quickly like to thank. First of all, John Ferguson, someone I went to school with, who reminded me on the way in that once you're a Vincentian, you always are. I was, for a while, the conference head at Summerhill. And I'd like to just acknowledge Sister Jan Barnett, who of course was principal for my sisters, of which I have 4 older sisters, and no surprise, 4 older brothers. So I think I'll just get you to hold that thought about what it is to be the youngest of 9 people in a 3-bedroom property growing up in Cogra. And without giving the game away, we really probably wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the assistance of St Vincent de Paul, given it was a single parent household. My mum did that on her own. But with all of that, what I just wanted to say is, and I'm really, really excited about the opportunities for us to do density well, have great opportunities where the state, federal and local government, all of them work together. We sometimes think, is a marathon? Is it a marathon or a sprint? Well, it's going to have to be a marathon because it's going to take a while. But I actually think it's better described as a triathlon. Think of it as a triathlon. We actually need state, federal and local pick which one you think should be the cyclist, which one's the swimmer, and which one's the runner. But what we see really well is when all three levels of government work together, in concert, doing great things. The problem is at the moment there's lots of talk about increasing supply. I get that, and we've, I think, identified a new area of supply we need for key workers, essential workers, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But at the end of the day, that won't necessarily deliver the numbers that we need for people who continue to miss out. And a better measure than affordability, which is one we often go to, you can measure it. We talk about the bottom quintiles, the bottom 2 quintiles. Housing security is a far more subjective thing, much harder to achieve, but really that is the gold standard. So I'll just talk very briefly about a particular aspect, and then happy to take questions on the panel about homelessness, other things to do with severe overcrowding. When we talk about affordable housing, and there's a bit of confusion out there about what we mean, affordable housing for key workers. What we're talking about, what Sue's done a great job of explaining, is how the planning system, which can involve private providers at a local level, they too have got their place, they too can contribute, but at the end of the day, it's small amounts. And I'll come back to why that small amount can be material. We need governments to step in. Markets fail, they fail repeatedly and in ways that we know. And if we're never not sure about that, floods, fire, COVID has taught us what happens when markets fail. We need governments to step in very quickly. Markets aren't good at jumping in when there's an emergency. And indeed, for our sins, one of the things that Shelter New South Wales has been involved with quite recently, which demonstrates to me, sometimes I think when we talk about Sydney property and what's happening in housing, we think the analogy is a bit like a big game of Monopoly. It's more like snakes and ladders. And I've got a very good friend, and Sister Jan knows who she is, who had the misfortune of living in Mascot Towers. Now there's about 5 people there that we've been assisting. It stopped being a housing issue and became a health issue, a mental health issue for a lot of them, an emotional issue. So when we talk about housing security, which I'll always say, please come back to that. Harder to measure, but that's the gold standard. Lots of discussion about whether something's affordable or not. I can give somebody a token to have their rent reduced next week, but if their lease is finishing the week after, it's a bit of a moot point. It's a bit of a sword of Damocles. So housing security is a really good gold standard. Housing affordability is one lens that we use to measure it, by no means the only one. And that brings me to this discussion about density. When we talk about density, we need to make sure it's done well. And so the best measure of density done well is not just affordability for people who will often rent their whole life, increasingly with children and pets for a long time in apartment living. We need to make sure it's done equitably and fairly. So density done well is probably the real challenge. And the reason why I say that is that we don't, at Shelter, we're all great fans of density around train stations and all sorts of things happening, but let's not give away the idea that a very small percentage of some of that density might be given over for organisations, for people who are at this stage, it's not social housing, we get that, it's affordable housing, a different product, mainly aimed at key workers on modest wages who at the moment travel huge distances, often out of hours, to do often manual work for very minimal wages. We think about the care industry, childcare workers, aged care workers, people who work out as checkout operators. We often say these are the people, the checkout operators, the carers, the people who kept us all fed, safe and watered during COVID, the cleaners. So just to be clear, a couple of things to leave you with. When we talk about density being done well, let's be clear that whatever incentives, bonuses or opportunities that are given, especially to the private market, to deliver that, because some of that will flow to the workers, let's make sure it's enough and it's going to the right workers. And it's lovely, I think, confident enough in this group to say, if only it was the teachers and the AMBOs and the nurses, that's heroic. That's lovely, I get that idea. But we're really talking about a cohort of people who increasingly, on minimum wages, are struggling to be able to afford the rent in pretty ordinary places. So great that we're increasing supply. Will supply in and of itself necessarily increase people's housing affordability? No. So at the moment, just to finish, and Yolanda made the point that we've dropped below 5% in New South Wales. We once led the country really in terms of providing social housing. So when we now talk about social and affordable housing, which has become the language we all use, social and affordable, when we talk about affordable in that context, we're saying that, I often say when I go to a party that there's going to be beer and wine. You sort of think there's going to be as much beer as there is wine. There's this much beer and this much wine. Social housing, 5% of all the stock if we measure it on a good day, and that's if I include even aged care and some student housing, call it 5%. Less than 5% of that 5%, and I'll say that again because it was a bit of a penny dropping moment for me, less than 5% of that 5% is capital A, affordable, regulated rental housing that's provided through the planning system that organisations like Graham's get to manage, hopefully in perpetuity, but some still for 10 or 15 years. So just as a note of, not caution or warning, but just to be aware that we're all fans of density, it must be done well, and it's not just more affordable, there's a whole lot of A's. It must be accessible, it must be adaptable and able to be used for people as they change their family needs. It absolutely must be accessible. We think that in planning, Sue will get me on this, I used to think DA, but it meant development application. Somebody said to me recently, DA should stand for Dylan Alcott. If Dylan Alcott can't come to your house for a party, and he says this, then why are we continuing to build it? It's a really simple one. Everything we build from now on, given that we only add 1 or 2%, 2% in a good year to the total stock, most of what we're dealing with now has already been built. Real challenge is retrofitting what we've got. Let's make sure, please, that anything we build moving forward, including government, is 100% accessible for everyone. That's one of the least things that we could do. We really shouldn't be allowing or accepting that any social housing is built that's not fully accessible. So that's one of the other A's. So it has to be affordable, has to be accessible, has to be adaptable, and absolutely to finish, it must have good amenity. Increasingly, as we say, if people are living with children in apartments during things like COVID, so you're not just living there, you're working there, you're studying there, you're recovering from illness, it must have good amenities. So I think we would just make sure at Shelter that, yes, we're happy for more density to occur, it needs to increase supply, but in and of itself, it won't necessarily make a difference tomorrow to the people who need it. We need to do a bit more, so let's not give away the family farm for what might be very small pickings. Thank you.
And we will come in a moment to what some of the opportunities are to start advocating around some of these A's. But before we get there, Graham, I'm wondering if you can talk to, from your perspective as a CEO of a housing provider that will be providing and does provide some of this affordable rental housing, what do you think the implications are for our rural and regional communities in particular? Because I think some of this conversation tends to be very Sydney-centric, and as Sue said, we've got 2% that could apply across the state. Is it going to deliver for people outside of Greater Western Sydney?
Good morning, and may I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. I come from the lands of the Thurrbal people, and I want to also acknowledge the many Vincentians that have been in the room that have been advocating. Is this working? That's better. There you go. Been advocating on this issue for many years. Before I answer the question of rural and regional, I would say I sit here going through 3 different thought processes again. Sometimes I sit here being very cynical. I've been in government for 15 years, I was around government, and I've been listening to these arguments for 20 years or more. And that's one thing that frustrates me. We've been talking about key workers, affordable housing, increasing the supply, funding the community housing sector for that entire time. So that's one voice that's in my head. Very cynical, is this going to happen? Then the other part is anger. I feel really angry about this. And I think many Vincentians do. I get to see the people this affects. You get to see the people this affects. And there are 5,000 people in New South Wales alone on the priority housing list. Now, to be on that list, that's not overcrowding necessarily. That's not someone who can, be a bit better off by having cheaper rental. These are people who could be sleeping on the streets. These are people in substandard accommodation. These are people that need help now. So you can hear I get angry. But then I try and remain hopeful. I try and remain hopeful because I've been involved in Vinnie's now for, Yolanda's comment, 34 years. And I remember our first project, setting up a night patrol in the streets of Campbelltown and working with Brian's wife in the conference up there and being inspired and seeing what a difference it makes any time we help one person. So I want to change the system. Cynical about that. I want to help those 5,000 people. Very angry about that. But I'm also hopeful that we can make small changes that will help one person, that will help 2 people. And in helping one person, we start setting that family up for generations, and that's how we change the world. And I remember Frederick Osenham, his first failed thing, remember he ran up those steps, dumped a load of firewood, so scared when the person ran off the door, didn't know what to do. And now we sit part of a global network of people trying to change the world. So I'm going to go with hope. But in that hope, planning density is not just going to be enough. So we need some increases in density. We can't do that density though at the expense of public open space. You can't just put people in boxes and not give them parks to live in. You can't give them places where they can be free and have their children on around. So be careful that we don't allow density to become an excuse to wipe out all the green spaces that we need. It needs to be sensible density. We need density to be in perpetuity control of community housing organisations. If I was going to be very cynical, and I said I wasn't going to be able to put it on for a second, I'm going to build a development, I'm going to give 10 of these units to a community housing provider for affordable housing, fantastic. But what I'm going to do on the side is I'm going to increase my strata fees, and increase my strata fees until I, as a community housing organisation, actually can't afford, I'm paying the landlord to keep someone in. So we actually need some change, and you can advocate for people to actually say not only perpetuity community housing, but capped on those strata fees for community housing. Otherwise, we can't afford to keep people in those houses. So that's one thing. I also think we need to stop putting money into future funds and spending the interest. We could spend that $10 billion tomorrow and help those 5,000 people and their brothers and sisters around the country. But instead, we're spending the interest, 500 million or so, and we're making it on a loan system. So we're in the HAF program, as Vince mentioned, we're putting into the HAF program, but we're going to pay back about 95% of the money that's given to us, and about 75% of that is going to be at commercial rates, which means, unlike the past where government was subsidising these things, the poorest people in the community are paying for us to build and own that home and not getting equity. So we've got to keep making sure that grant funding remains. We cannot let them off the hook on this. And I have to say, luckily the state government is still doing grant funding. But we need to continue to do that and do more. Don't be fooled by $10 billion, meaning that $10 billion is actually going into helping people right now. What I also know is that in our rural communities, and I moved to a rural community many years ago, and I know that in rural communities we joke that New South Wales stands for Newcastle, Sydney and Wollongong. But outside the west of the divide, we went to look at building some projects. We have a fantastic conferences out there, as you know, and in Forbes community, there's 35 units we can build. We went and had a look at that, the council's on board, it's needed out there, and talk about needing to upgrade. Now under this HAF program, we went and did the sums. We can't build that program under this because, I'm going to make figures up because I've got a blank something in my head, it's going to cost us, say, $15 million to build them. The day we finish building them, they're only worth about 10. So we can't get a government loan to do that. So when it comes to regional areas, we actually need to decide as a community that we value regional Australia, that we actually will spend money, and we'll probably spend more per head to do that. And if we don't do that, then we will see those regional areas move into absolute poverty. And I don't want to see that happen. And I think we need a vibrant rural and regional community to keep us all alive. We need those connections with land, we need those connections with space, and we also, place is so important. If you're not connected to a place, I simply lost the microphone. If you're not connected to a place, then when you move, you are so dislocated and isolated. We see this all the time, and forcing people to leave those communities simply because we can't afford housing will actually affect people's mental health. So we need to actually be changing the system and saying to governments, federal government, we want the money spent now. We don't want just future funds. That's one thing I'd be asking the federal government to do. $10 billion is not a lot, by the way. That won't solve the crisis, but it would do something. State governments, we need you to make sure that if you're serious about community housing, looking after this for long term, it's in perpetuity, and we need you to cap the strata fees. We actually need to make sure that you don't take that money off the community housing providers in return for providing it. We are not there to subsidise government. We are there to provide housing for people. So that's the second thing I'd ask. The third thing I would say is go and invest in regional and rural New South Wales. These communities matter. They may not have as many seats as the city does, but they matter and the people there matter, and we expect you to spend the money there. So that's another thing I'll be saying. And to local government, on Thursday I was in another jurisdiction, going in hand to hand, talking to councillors who voted down a social housing development, even though they supported something bigger and uglier further down the road that wasn't social housing, having to go hand to hand to them and say, look, we're very sorry you feel that way, these are the things we're going to do. We're going to say local government, social housing should be given special treatment when it comes to actually approvals. Just like the government has given themselves the power to approve their own social housing provisions, community housing providers should do the same. So I need to stop. I can see Solange in my peripheral vision there. But there are 4 things we can easily do, all 3 levels of government, that will make a difference. And the other part is, I want to go back, we need to stay hopeful. We do. Tap into that anger, be cynical, but stay hopeful. And I think we as a society can lead that change. And I want to acknowledge all the work that you're doing, the social justice team, Yolanda and the State Council here, in actually making sure that housing and housing policy is front and centre of our advocacy campaigns.
So Graham has segued us nicely into what are the opportunities and what is it that our governments can be doing to increase the supply of social and affordable housing. Sue, I might come to you. We've maybe got about 2 or 3 minutes to hear from you about what do you think the government needs to do to increase the supply of social and affordable housing?
Yeah, okay. So I'll do my very best because this is a complex issue. And a few months ago I was at a productivity commission discussion, and I asked the panellists, do you think the reason we had a housing crisis is because there's a lack of political will to do something about it? And I got howled down that it's really our fault. And I mean everyone in this room and everyone, because we don't ask our governments to do more. So I think it is important to go out there with a list of things you expect the government to do, and don't vote for them if they don't do it, because that appears to be the only chance we've got to address this. But here's some of the things that governments could do. And at all levels of government, own land. I think there's, for every car in Australia, there's 6 car parking spaces. There's 100,000 hectares of land devoted to at-grade public car parks. We would not have a housing crisis if that land, or not all of it, but some of it was redeveloped as housing, particularly social and affordable housing. So yes, they have land and they could redevelop it. The simple thing that could be done today is that it shouldn't be a 2% requirement for affordable housing. It should be a much higher number, and the number should be around about 10%. And in 2016, the former Greater Sydney Commission proposed that. And the then Liberal government, or Liberal National Party government, would not support that. So it came out with nothing in terms of a requirement for affordable and social housing. So we've lost 8 years. We could have had 10 years of affordable housing being part of new proposals. We also need Treasury not to be the agency that determines how land is to be used, because at the moment they account for it, and therefore to maintain as explained to me by a former Minister for Planning, to maintain the AAA credit rating, they don't want to develop land at where they effectively reduce the value of the land. And that's causing part of the problem and their failure to deliver social housing on public land. We have plenty of land. Land is not the problem. There is a political will issue in terms of developing land for social and affordable housing, and at the moment the development sector will push hard against any increase in that 2% affordable housing levy, because they're struggling to make their sites feasible, which might lead to a discussion about whether or not the way in which we tax land needs to be changed. But that's more than I have enough time to talk about. But at the moment we tend to tax the developer and the original landowner walks away with all the money in their pocket, an increase in value because it's been upzoned. Perhaps some of that needs to be shared between the community, which would reduce some of the costs to the developer and be more chance of delivering more affordable housing on individual sites. But that is something you need to do, and it requires the effort of all levels of government. Like I say, there's 100,000 hectares of at-grade car parking in Australia, which could be, say half was for affordable housing and social housing. What the difference that would make. So it is about political will.
So John, I might pose a similar question to you. What are some of the things that we can do now to deliver on some of those A's that you talked about before?
So very quickly and very, we haven't practiced by the way, but it looks like it's a great way that Sue's passed the baton to me. There was a great announcement on Thursday that the Inner West Council of Sydney, which has had a recent falling of the scales from their eyes when it comes to affordable housing, I can tell you about, has put up three car parks that they've identified. And we at Shelter New South Wales spoke in support of that at council, said it was a great idea. And I'm really pleased to hear, not only did it happen, it was unanimous. So the Inner West Council of Sydney, and we sort of had a bit of a go at them, they opposed a otherwise very worthy development on a site, organisation similar to Graham's, it was called Fresh Hope Housing. They fought it in the court, so apologies if anyone hears from the Inner West. I know they've moved a bit since. But on that particular site, which was an old church, hadn't had a working congregation for about 10 years, and otherwise, I think Rob Stokes, as the Minister for Planning at the time, said of the 73 churches of architectural merit in the area, it was probably 72. Even one of the Liberal or independent councillors described as looking like an electricity substation. So not a beautiful church by any means. But council fought tooth and nail for that not to be turned into 52 units of low-cost housing for women with supports, mainly women with support services in the Inner West, much needed. Council didn't have to put in a cent for it, in perpetuity, not 52 hours a week that a congregation might have otherwise used the church if it was functioning, an hour a week, probably 2 hours at Easter and 2 at Christmas. So similar set for all 52 weeks. What's not to like about that? But you'll be amazed, that's a bit of a lightning rod example that we've seen recently, where local councils have had to say we can no longer, and especially seemingly progressive ones like that in the Inner West of Sydney, can get away with not leaning in. So, whilst Sue made absolute mention of the formal mechanism, an affordable housing contribution scheme, that's the formal long-term thing to get to. But in the meantime, councils can do lots. And the reason why I say that, I know that we've got a federal election coming up next year, we've got a state budget coming up soon, but on the 4th of September this year, we do have local council elections. And one of the things that Dr. Kim William, I'll come back to him, the guy who runs the Regional Australia Institute says, council car parks are a really good source of potential housing. It's really easy, it's a bit of a no-brainer. So really pleased to see that things are happening, they should happen more, and good advocacy and appeals by people like yourselves at a conference and the local level all throughout the state. I think we've got 133 councils in New South Wales that are all coming up to their elections on the 4th of September. We will be putting out a survey that asks every single candidate, what's your position on a number of things, and one of them is, do you support the use of at-grade car parks in your council area to be leased or given long-term to community organisations, well-regulated, well-run. It's one of New South Wales' best stories we can talk about in the last 25 years, the growth and development and support of the community housing sector. So organisations like Graham's and other ones, they do this stuff really well. So I think I would say, to answer that question and to carry on the baton from Sue, local council elections coming up on the 4th of September, getting councillors or people who are applying to be potential candidates to be on those councils, both existing and new, what would you do more in this space of supporting council to proactively go in? So that's what we say. Yes, you can wait for an affordable housing contribution scheme, but in the meantime, get out of the way, or rather support good organisations with a proven track record of doing this. I think the Inner West Council under Darcy Byrne would say now, yeah, we probably should have used the 4-letter assessment, or the 4 letters of assessment, that what we should have done, which is what would Jesus do. I did say that to Darcy as the mayor. He did cast the final vote and that got through, but it very nearly didn't. It very nearly didn't. And that particular proponent, a church organisation, spent well over $1 million trying to get the development up, and at the last minute, the council tried to put out heritage order on it. it wasn't upheld, which was good. But that's how close it can come. I think the world's shifting. It needs to shift more, and all across the state. To Graham's point about regional, there's some great opportunities in regional towns. I think of Tumen, I think of all sorts of places that I've been to. But I think those communities, those councils, if they were backed in by good communities and local conferences like yourselves, it would be relatively easy to increase over a number of places the supply of at least affordable housing for key workers in those towns.
Thanks, John. There is, I believe just at this moment, there's an opportunity to apply to the affordable housing campaign that we're working on with Shelter and through the Sydney Alliance, but we will be looking to spread that across the state. There's a flyer in your packs if you want to find out more and you're keen to get on board. Sue was talking about political will. John has just talked to us about, how we can help create some of that change at the local level. We have a room full of people who are very committed and want to see change. As a former government minister, what would be your advice or takeaway for us about how we can help create that change and get that political will across the line?
Turning up is really important, and I don't mean, in a simple way. I mean actually going and knocking on the doors of the MPs. And there's one thing about MPs is there's so many things swirling around in the world that need fixing. And it's not so much the loudest voice that will get the attention, but the one that scares them the most for their seats. And we, as a network of people, have the ability to go and meet with our local MP, wearing that hat that says St Vincent de Paul Society opens doors. And I would say don't go as a whole conference, go as in groups of 3. Go in a group of 3, and then the different 3 go as well. And when they say, oh, we already saw some people at St Vincent de Paul, you say, oh yes, but I live in your electorate anyway, and I want to come and talk about it as well. And then get your friends to go and do that. And if you've got people who have lived experience and are comfortable and supported in going and talking about it, that's also very confronting for people when they actually meet the face of the person that's not being helped. And that needs to be done respectfully and carefully. But there are people who are passionate advocates in this space, and they need to go along with there. And the other part is we need to go along with some consistent asks. So raise the awareness, put them on the spot so that they actually feel that this needs to have pressure put on, and then go with consistent asks. And on top of those other things that I spoke about before, it's very simple. We want works, not words. Really, we don't. It's very easy to say words. I'm saying them now, but we need works. We actually need things done now. And if you've got a spot in your local community or an organisation in your local community that knows it's got something done, bring it up, use it as an example. And then the final part, I'd say, and this is a bigger one, we need support services. St Vincent de Paul Society is the largest homeless prevention service in the country outside of government. You think of what we do. We prevent people falling into homelessness through conference visitation. We get them back into homes through the crisis accommodation system we run. We provide homes through the homeless services we run. We support people in all those stages of life. So we have credibility in this. Don't be afraid to think, I don't know. We as a society have credibility in this. And if we're saying to the community, we need this to be done, then I think that carries weight. But we need to be saying over and over and over and over and over and over again. And we need to be doing it face to face with every chance we get, probably to the point where the MP goes, oh no, that's that person from St Vincent de Paul. They're going to ask me why I haven't done housing. And I think that's probably the level we need to get to. Support services though, change lives. So Brett's team over here have been running a program through the housing, which actually provides support services. The University of New South Wales report said that the outcomes in all outcomes, except for health, so I acknowledge that, all outcomes are actually equal with the general community of people. They're well above general social housing. So support services don't just provide a person with a home, they actually change that community and that family. So knock on the doors, knock on the doors, knock on the doors, knock on the doors. Email, Facebook, sure, nothing like face-to-face.
Thank you, Graham. I will just use that as an opportunity to plug this afternoon. If you are thinking about going to visit your MP, we have the lovely Veronica who's stood up at excellent timing, who'll be running a session. And we also have, if you do want to think about how you can involve people with lived experience in your advocacy, we do also have a session on that this afternoon, so have a look out for that. We've got about 2 minutes before morning tea, so I am going to cut the questions, I'm sorry, because what I would really love to hear from, and this isn't on our program, sorry, Brooke, is from John Engeler has brought his daughter Maeve today, and Maeve is a mini Vinnies, and we don't have great representation from our youth members today, so I would really love if you could indulge us to hear from Maeve as she wants to share some of her perspectives about people experiencing homelessness. So just while she comes up to the stage, if you can please thank our fantastic panel. They have got so much experience in tackling on this subject.
So I've made a bit of a speech. I am a Mini Vinnies representative from St. Patrick's Summerhill, and I'm here to speak to you about what we can do to tackle these stereotypes of the homeless people, because a lot of you probably know that not all homeless people are living in poverty. In fact, some are living in cars, but they can't necessarily pay to fuel those cars. So I want you to put your hand up if you've ever seen or met someone who is homeless. This should not be happening. I should not be here. I am lucky, and we are lucky to be in a rich, prestigious city. Homelessness should not be a thing here. Many people have created this stereotype that homeless people are living in poverty or sleeping rough. But a lot of people, as my dad mentioned, are living in units with 7 other people. This is called severe overcrowding. And I am 10 years old, but I am not blind to what is unjust. And I know that people should not be living in units with 7 other people. We learnt this in COVID. Many people my age can go on, think that they can go on with life and homelessness will just magically evaporate. But unless we take action, it will eventually fall down on us. If I can make a difference, anyone can. Thank you.
Fantastic. I think the future of Vinnies, if we have members of Mini Vinnies like you, Maeve, is very strong. So thank you for sharing that with us.